Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I hope you're enjoying your morning. Here it's a little bit later at night, but it's great to be here. And I'd like to thank Dr. Chan and Dr. Choi for organizing this and having me a part of this wonderful conference, and Dr. Choi for serving as moderator. I also want to thank the John Templeton Foundation for their support of some of the research in this project. I always like to thank my wonderful colleagues and graduate students here and across the globe uh, who've made the process of doing research in this field so rich and deep and fun. Uh, the study of spirituality is quite complex, and I think so complex it can't be grasped by any single person. We need to approach it, I think, as a team and work collaboratively. And as far as teams go, I've had the best, so I'm very grateful for that. Let me start with a little bit of reflection. When I began in the field almost 50 years ago, hard to believe, um, there was relatively research on the topic. I could get caught up on the research by going to the library once a semester and reviewing recent publications. Um, this might have seemed surprising given that the founding figures in psychology, such as William James, felt that religious experience belonged at the very center of the field. But the topic lost popularity in the 20th century as the field tried to establish itself as more scientific. Um, Towards the end of the 20th century, though, the picture did begin to change. As you can see here in this review of citations to religion and spirituality over several decades, research on the topic of religion has increased over these years. The research on the topic of spirituality has increased even more at a more dramatic rate. And today the field is, I would say, flourishing. It would be virtually impossible for me to stay current in the field by visiting the library once a semester. It's just so much is going on, and this research is being published in so many forms. Okay, well, in this talk, I'd like to raise a question that's been really central in the psychology of religion for many years. And the question is whether spirituality is a help or a hindrance in mental health. So to end the suspense, I'll answer the question right away. Is spirituality a help or hindrance? The answer is, it depends. Please don't shoot me. I'm sure you'd like a more straightforward answer, but I hope you'll see this is actually the most accurate answer. In this talk, I'm going to make the point that spirituality is both bitter and sweet. It's double-sided. It can be a source of great help to people, but it can also be a source of harm. And that's including people facing serious problems in living. The pragmatic value of spirituality, we're going to see, depends on how people understand and relate to whatever they hold sacred, transcendent, or godly. I'll be drawing over 40 years of research on spiritual coping and struggles to make my point. But I want to offer a caveat up front. And it's this: as researchers, we can't speak to the ontological validity or ultimate truth of God or views of God, or whatever we may hold sacred. We can only address what Daniel Batson described as the footprints left by faith. The footprints left by faith. So when I speak of God, the sacred, or transcendent today, please know I'm speaking about beliefs or perceptions or relationships with whatever we do hold sacred, however that may be understood. I'm not speaking to the actual truth of these religious beliefs and claims. That goes beyond the province of academic psychology. We're going to be covering a lot of territory in the next couple of talks, and if you find this material of interest and you want to dive more deeply into it, much of what I described is in one of my 3 books, The Psychology of Religion and Coping, Spiritually Integrated Therapy, and most recently, my book with Julie Exline, Working with Spiritual Struggles in Psychotherapy. That's my only plug for my work today. So let's focus first on spirituality as a resource, that side of the spiritual dimension. It's often said that there are no atheists in foxholes. But like many old sayings, this one is really not completely accurate. We can and do find atheists who are atheists before their traumatic experiences, during their foxhole experiences, and after their foxhole experiences. But it does seem to be the case that the impulse to reach out to a higher power or a transcendent force is what we might say quickened in stressful times. Now, this figure I'm showing you here makes the point. It comes from an international study of the frequency of Google searches for the term prayer. And this is among a very large sample of people from 60 countries all over the world. And what you can see here is the dramatic rise in searches for the term prayer when the reality of the scope and power of the COVID-19 epidemic began to hit home in March of 2020. You can see that many people appear to turn to whatever they hold sacred for support in this time of uncertainty. And this is, I believe, an important dimension of who we are as people. How helpful was their faith to them? Well, I'd say it depends on how they view and relate to God or the sacred. Again, spirituality is double-sided, and it has double-sided implications for mental health. Let me focus first on the positive side. We're going to be talking about spirituality as a resource. Literally hundreds of studies over a wide range of groups have shown that many people do in fact find support and assistance from their spirituality in difficult times. These are studies of people with physical illness, mental illness, soldiers, divorcees, physically abused spouses, parents of children with disability, victims of trauma, and migrants. So there's quite a bit of support for the idea that people turn to their faith in stressful times and find it to be a source of sustenance. Now, my colleagues and I, we've measured positive spiritual coping methods. These are specific ways people draw on their faith in difficult times. And it consists of items such as these. I looked for a stronger connection with God. I sought God's love and care. I sought help from God in letting go of my anger. I tried to put my plans into action together with God. I tried to see how God might be trying to strengthen me in this situation. Now, keep in mind here that we encourage people to use whatever term that is most appropriate for them when talking about God. So they can replace God with higher power, transcendent force, or the sacred. And the scale still seems to be a reliable and valid measure. But for simplicity's sake, in my talk, I'll be referring largely to God. These positive spiritual coping methods rest on a foundation of a particular way of understanding and relating to a higher or transcendent power. From this perspective, God is viewed as present, loving, and trustworthy. And people believe they have a secure connection with this God, just as they might have a secure connection with a parent. And it's this strong base of connectedness to something sacred that people are able to draw on when they access positive religious coping methods. Now, there's a large body of research that has linked these efforts at positive spiritual coping to positive mental health outcomes. Let me just give you a couple of examples from this large literature. In one study in the state of Mississippi in the United States, residents had gone through Hurricane Katrina, which was a terrible hurricane in New Orleans. And the researchers found that those who made more use of positive spiritual coping experienced less risk of PTSD, depression, poor quality of life, and greater alcohol use. In another study of HIV patients from Miami, Florida, these are patients who are in the mid-stage of their disease. Positive spiritual coping predict higher rates of survival over 17 years later. In another meta-analysis of 100 global studies on stress-related growth done by researchers at the University of Bologna in Italy, they examined variables such as positive spiritual coping, optimism, social support, and coping and secular coping. And positive spiritual coping emerged as the strongest predictor of stress-related growth in this study, along with optimism. Along these lines, just this morning in the US time, I came across this study I thought would be relevant. This is a study of positive spiritual coping among parents in mainland China. It was just published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. And it involved 189 parents of children with intellectual disabilities. And what the researchers found was that positive spiritual coping was directly related to greater family quality of life. Interestingly, they also found that this link between positive spiritual coping and quality of life was partly explained by mindfulness. So what specifically does spirituality offer as a resource? What is it about spirituality that seems to be of benefit to people? Well, first, it offers comfort. A nice example of this comes from a study by Amy Wachholz. She was very interested in meditation research, and she noted in her readings that oftentimes practitioners write that the mantra doesn't matter as long as it's meaningful to the individual. Well, we tested that idea and tested the idea whether comfort from God would be more beneficial than comfort from other sources in a mantra-based meditation. So we randomly assigned 83 college students with chronic headaches to one of 4 treatments: a spiritual meditation group where they meditated to phrases like God is peace and God is love; an internal focused secular meditation, meditating to phrases like I'm content, I am joyful; an external secular meditation condition, meditating to phrases like grass is green and sand is soft; and a progressive muscle relaxation group. And each of the groups practiced their technique 20 minutes a day for 4 weeks. Now, I have to admit that I myself was skeptical that the content of the meditative mantra would make a whole lot of difference. I mean, I felt like meditating to a phrase such as I'm content or grass is green, those sounded pretty good to me. But Amy really believed that a spiritual phrase might magnify the power of the meditation. And in fact, she proved herself right. She found that over the course of the study, over the month, the number of headaches among the spiritual meditators declined significantly greater than the other three groups. She also found that pain tolerance, measured by how long you could keep your hands in ice water, the cold pressure task, was twice as long among spiritual meditators as members of the other three groups, which is quite a powerful effect. So I think this is really an important study that that showed that the benefits from seeking comfort from God magnified the effects of the meditation. Um, and the study has been now replicated. It's also been found that this type of meditation, spiritual meditation, reduces the use of pain medication, analgesics among people with chronic pain. In addition to being a source of support, spirituality can be a source of power for many people. Here's an example from a woman with HIV, and she writes, "I'm speaking to my higher power, my God, and I give thanks to that power. It's been a source of strength. You know, it's like tapping into some sort of power source that I can recharge my batteries." The idea that God can be empowering comes as a surprise to some mental health providers who may hold the stereotype that beliefs in God are passive forms of coping that encourage people to avoid facing reality and developing greater control and mastery. And sure, we can find examples of that, but empirical studies show that spirituality generally is more tied to active rather than passive forms of coping with problems. A third reason why spiritual coping may be so helpful to people is that it offers support when people are facing the limits of control and need a benevolent figure to be able to let go or surrender. Now, the culture of medicine and mental health, particularly in the West, generally tries to help people maximize their control, solve problems, extend mastery over oneself and the world. But in spite of all that activity, the reality is that we remain frail and finite beings. The reality is that no matter how well we extend ourselves in our lives, we will all eventually die. In spirituality, we find benevolent ways to come to terms with our frailty and our finitude. One way is through active surrender. Here's an example of what I mean by active surrender. Another individual with HIV wrote that I pray a lot. I gave it to God because I couldn't deal with it. It was too stressful for me. It was like a load had been lifted off of me. I didn't have to worry about that because I knew it was in God's hands. Now, we've measured this kind of active surrender. Here are some illustrative items. I do my best, then turn the situation over to God. I do what I can and put the rest in God's hands. I take control over what I can and give the rest up to God. I hope you get a sense of what that looks like. You'll see that active surrender doesn't mean passively giving up. Instead, it means doing your best and then letting go what's uncontrollable to God. And it has been tied to better mental health. For instance, in a study by Tracy and Michael Balboni and their colleagues at Harvard, they found that spiritual care by the medical team at end of life was tied to greater quality of life, greater likelihood of receiving hospice care, and less likelihood of pursuing aggressive medical care. And why was that? Well, I think it's because the spiritual care helped people let go and surrender to God when they had reached the limits of their control. And that letting go may have facilitated their well being at this time of life. Okay, well, let's shift gears here now from spirituality as a mental health resource to spirituality as a type of problem. There is a darker side to spirituality. There are many types of spiritual problems. Spirituality has been tied to extremism, prejudice, hypocrisy, crippling guilt, passivity, denial, and abuse. Spirituality, I want to stress, is generally a valued resource in people's lives. But even so, there are times when people encounter internal or external events or transitions that leave them shaken to the core, shaken to the core. They call into question the most fundamental beliefs, values, and connections, including the connection with what we hold sacred. And these are times of spiritual struggle. Now, spiritual struggles are only one type of spiritual problem, but a great deal of research has been conducted on them in recent years. So let me just focus on them here. Here's our definition of spiritual struggle. They refer to experiences of tension, strain, and conflict about sacred matters within oneself, with others, and with God. As a group, they rest on an insecure relationship with God. Now, again, if positive religious coping methods rest on a secure relationship with God, spiritual struggles rest on an insecure relationship with God and the sacred. This is a relationship that's unstable, unpredictable, and untrustworthy. There are several types of struggle. Julie Eckstein and I, Julie's just a wonderful colleague, we spent several years trying to identify and measure struggles, and we identified 6 types. We make no claims that these are the only types of struggle, and in fact, we're pretty sure there are others. But I should add, these struggles also do have a Western bias. For instance, they don't address people from polytheistic traditions. But we think these specific struggles cover a lot of territory, at least in monotheistic contexts. And we've done a lot of research now, and my colleagues as well have extended studies beyond the West to studies of nations and cultures all over the world, and find that these types of struggles seem to be applicable across a number of nations. Let me just review these types of struggle briefly. There are divine struggles. These involve tensions and conflicts focused on God. Here are some sample items from our measure. I felt angry at God. I felt as though God had abandoned me. I felt that God was punishing me. And you can see examples of this in the scripture, in the book of Psalms, in the Hebrew Bible, and in Jesus on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Here's another example, much more recent. This came from one of my undergraduate students who is dealing with bipolar illness, and she heard my lecture on spiritual struggles, and she emailed me this. She said, "I'm suffering, really suffering. My illness is tearing me down, and I'm angry at God for not rescuing me. I mean, really setting me free from my mental bondage. I've been dealing with these issues for 10 years now, and I'm only 24. I don't know why he keeps lifting me up just to let me come crashing down." There are also moral struggles. These are struggles in our efforts to follow our moral or spiritual higher principles. Here are some illustrative items. And there are ultimate meaning struggles in which we question with the deeper meaning of life. Again, here are some items that tap into whether we're questioning what the ultimate purpose is to one's life in general or on one's specific life. There are doubt-related struggles involving questions about core religious beliefs. For instance, worrying about whether your beliefs are correct, feeling confused about your beliefs. There are interpersonal spiritual struggles involving conflicts with other people or institutions about religious issues. And there are demonic struggles involving feelings of being attacked by the devil or negative or evil spirits. And again, here are some examples. Let's just briefly review some basic points about struggle. They're pretty commonplace. For instance, in one study of advanced cancer patients, 58% endorsed some type of spiritual struggle. About a fourth to one-third of the sample said they wondered why God allowed their cancer to happen, wondered whether they're being abandoned by God, felt angry at God, felt cancer might be a punishment from God. What causes struggles? Well, we think they grow out of a number of factors: situational, spiritual, personal, and social. For instance, here are some situational factors that can trigger struggles: illness, such as COVID, natural disasters, transgressions, climate change, war, forced migration, and sociopolitical conflict. All of these may trigger struggles. In addition, struggles have been tied to insecure attachments to parents and to God, personal vulnerability in the form of neuroticism and anger and pessimism, a truth-seeking orientation, trying to find answers to deep spiritual questions. And we also find, although struggles can be found in every stage of life, they're particularly commonplace in adolescence, when lots of questions are being asked by adolescents in an effort to form their own identity and their own perspectives on things about spirituality. But we think it's important to stress that spiritual struggles are a natural part of life. They're not pathological. Even so, they have the capacity to once again shake us to our core, our most fundamental beliefs and practices and values and connections. And this can be quite disorienting and painful. For instance, here's one example from a Roman Catholic nun who had been denied the chance to pursue further education. And she writes, "The frustration of it all swept over me like waves on a beach, pulling me under, upending me in deep water, washing me out away from a firm emotional shore. Day after day, the struggle raged. Struggle is never done without cost. Real struggle marks us for life." And in fact, many studies have shown that spiritual struggles are tied to a lot of negative outcomes. For one, they're associated with poor mental health. These are just examples of a few studies. One study, a large survey study in the United States, showed that spiritual struggles were associated with every type of major psychopathology. In a recent study by Richard Cowden, he found that spiritual struggles predicted declines over time in 16 of 18 measures of whole person functioning and flourishing among Columbian University students. That's from Columbia, the country. That should be a COLO, not you. Courier found that among veterans in the United States returning from deployment in the Middle East, that spiritual struggles sharply increased the risk of suicidality. Spiritual struggles have also been tied to poor physical health, including more physical pain and interference from pain, worsening of HIV symptoms, and even a higher mortality rate over time among medically ill elderly patients. Spiritual struggles are tied to self-regulation problems, including disordered eating, poor medication adherence, and greater risk of substance use. I should add that studies are showing that spiritual struggles are tied to religious disengagement, what we call religious exiting from religious institutions. They've also been tied to spiritual decline over the years. So I think oftentimes before people exit spiritual and religious life, they go through a period of spiritual struggle. And they leave, I believe, when they haven't been able to find a successful resolution to their struggles. Here's another interesting finding. This is a structured equations model here, showing that in a national sample in the United States, spiritual struggles mediated, at least in part, the link between exposure to stressful life events and subsequent adjustment. It's very interesting because it suggests that when people encounter major life stressors or trauma, whether those traumas in fact lead to negative outcomes, in part is based on whether those traumas have triggered a spiritual struggle. Not everyone exposed to trauma struggles, and not everyone exposed to trauma has negative outcomes. But it looks like that combination of trauma and struggle is part of that, together seem to amplify the risk for subsequent problems. And this finding has been shown in other research projects as well. For instance, one study showed that spiritual struggles mediated the relationship between child sexual abuse and subsequent mental health problems in adulthood. Very interesting. So spiritual struggles, we believe, are a critical mediating variable. Up to this point, I've painted a pretty bleak or dark picture of spiritual struggles, and they do appear to be tied to a range of negative outcomes. But is that really the full story? Well, we wondered about that because much of the work in the mental health field says that struggles represent opportunities for growth. And theorists from Jean Piaget to Erik Erikson to James Fowler, they've all agreed that periods of stress, strain, and struggle are often precursors to growth and maturation. They're launching pads to help us grow and transform ourselves. Well, is that a pipe dream or is that a reality? First of all, it's important to consider what we mean by growth. Here, we're not talking about small incremental change, but more fundamental change in the worldview. Growth refers to transformation. In a widely used measure of stress-related growth that Tedeschi and Calhoun developed, items on the scale assess major changes, including a change in life priorities, the discovery of new personal strength, finding a new life path, and experiencing a greater sense of closeness with family, friends, community, and God. Here, again, we're talking about major transformation when we speak of growth. And again, struggles have generally been described in the literature as heroic journeys that have their trials and stormy periods. Does this apply to struggles? Well, I think each struggle may have its own capacity for growth. For instance, struggles with the divine might increase closeness with God. They might challenge old or simple ideas about the sacred or the transcendent. Moral struggles could foster some important soul searching. They could lead to greater awareness of one's moral limitations. They could encourage repentance and reconciliation with family and community. Ultimate meaning struggles, well, they could point to the emptiness of the values that we might be pursuing, and they could then lead to a deeper purpose in life. Doubt struggles, well, it's through doubt that we may cultivate critical thinking. doubt may help us decide what we truly believe versus what we've simply been told to believe. Do struggles lead to growth? Well, certainly we can find many examples in the classic religious literature, from Moses and Job to Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad. They all go through periods where they're challenged and struggle. But it's through that period of challenge and struggle that they emerge on the other side transformed. And in fact, I would say that in the religious literature, the story of struggles and their resolution are maybe some of the most central themes in the religious literature. We can find more modern day examples, narrative accounts of struggles leading to growth. God gives life depth and vision, insight and understanding. It not only transforms us, it makes us transforming. It teaches us how little we really need in life to be happy. It teaches us that every day life starts over again. Well, these are, I think, some really powerful support for the positive value of struggles, but empirical studies as yet really don't show a consistent link. And what does that mean? I think it means that at the very least, we have to avoid the temptation to really sentimentalize spiritual struggles. The old saying that pain leads to gain, well, that's not true. Pain doesn't inevitably lead to gain. Suffering doesn't always build character, and struggles don't always lead to growth. At times they may, but they can also lead to a great deal of pain. And in fact, struggles may be intertwined with both pain and gain. And we actually have some research findings to say that both processes may be going on. We think the more important question, and this is really a key question, is what determines whether struggles lead to growth and troubles, including death, when the struggles lead to decline, including death, or to more positive transformation. And we think it makes sense to see struggles as forks in the road. Struggles can lead to growth, they can lead to decline, and they can lead to both. So the key practical task for us as psychologists and mental health professionals is to listen for struggles among our clients and to help strugglers take the road to greater wholeness and growth. And how do we do that? Well, that's going to be the topic of an important part of the topic of the next talk and workshop. So let me conclude here. The relationship of spirituality to mental health is really double-sided. Spirituality can be a mental health resource, but it can also be a source of problems. But we can help clients draw on their spirituality as a resource, and we can help them address spiritual problems that may arise in their lives as well. To do that, we have to bring God, or whatever clients hold sacred, into the therapeutic conversation. And that's been a challenge for the field for a long time. We have to avoid addressing spirituality and treatment as something that's simple, because it's really no less complex than other aspects of care. But at the same time, it's not rocket science. We can apply our general skills as mental health professionals to the spiritual realm. We can discuss spiritual topics as any other sensitive topic, not as theologians, not as chaplains, but as mental health providers. And doing so, the evidence is showing can enhance the effectiveness of our care. So let me end on this note. The integration of spirituality and caregiving has the potential to illuminate, broaden, and deepen our approach to the ways we care for each other as individuals, families, and communities. Greater attention to both the positive and negative sides of religion and spirituality, greater attention to this double-sided character of spirituality can only enrich and vitalize our efforts to enhance the human condition. And a science and practice that chooses to ignore the spiritual dimension of human functioning then is incomplete. So in the next talk, I'm going to turn to the practical question of how. How do we enhance our competencies spiritually in mental health care? It's a really vital question. So at this point, I think this would be a good time to open it up for questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the comprehensive and insightful presentation about the effects of spiritualities. You are all participants are welcome to ask questions and provide any comments on the presentation. Any comments or questions from the floor? Okay, so I see one participant has had questions.
So thank you, Professor Kenneth, and I think that your presentation is really inspiring, especially for the mental health improving and this okay, and the counseling service or the psychotherapies. But I'm not sure that whether I missed something during your presentation, because I noticed that there is some result and a positive outcome when people have a higher have a religion background or have a higher spirituality. But I'm curious about where is there any different is there any difference between people have different religion backgrounds, such as people with Christian religion or Buddhism religion? Is there any different positive outcomes when they have different religion background?
That's a really interesting question. What we know so far is that some of these concepts that we work with in the psychology of religion and spirituality, including some concepts that overlap with positive psychology, we find that concepts such as positive spiritual coping, forgiveness, gratitude, feeling a sense of connectedness with the transcendent, they seem to be of value across religious traditions. In other words, whether you're Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish, it seems that these aspects or dimensions of spirituality and spiritual life seem to be pretty uniformly helpful. That's not to say there aren't some religious group differences that are important to look at, because there are. But on the whole, I believe we find that a lot of the benefits of religion and spirituality seem to cut across religious traditions.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Ken. This is Darryl Van Tongeren. Thanks for your excellent talk. My question is, and really maybe you don't know, maybe this is still an open question. Do you have a sense of what makes the difference between people who are able to do that work of translating the struggles into growth versus those that, you know, have the struggles and they de-identify, or they just languish. Just, you know, if you had a sense, like, what's the secret sauce that helps get people over that hump versus the ones that really do such a
Yeah.
poor job?
Yeah, Daryl, thank you so much. That's we used to call that the $64,000 question, but with inflation, we'd probably have to say $64 million question. But it is really the vital question. What determines the trajectory of spiritual struggles? And my colleagues and I, a number of people have been looking at that, and we have identified a number of fork in the road factors that we think make a difference. And I'll be talking some about them in the next workshop. But you know, some of the things are like important factors are whether people are able to accept rather than avoid the struggle. Can they face the struggle so they can try to come to terms with it? Do they have a supportive network of family, friends to help them make meaning of the struggle? Do they have mentors or models that they can follow? People who admit that they too have struggled and can kind of show the way of how they work their way through the struggle. When people have that, I think they can often resolve the struggle and maybe transform into a deeper, more fulfilling spiritual life. And if they can't, then they may, in fact, disengage. And as is obviously an important interest of yours here, we think that spiritual struggles are a kind of transitional process that people experience as many of them choose to go out the door. They can't sort out the struggle, and they say, "Boy, you know, this isn't for me." But we'll be talking more about that in the next presentation too. I'll be interested in your thoughts on that for all the work you've been doing.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another questions and comments.
Hi, Ken. Kirk Bingaman. Thank you so much for your dialectical presentation. I appreciate you know, the benefits of spiritual coping and, you know, potential problems. It you know, introduces a reality check that's much needed. Thank you for that. And you know, I pay attention to a lot of the empirical data and certainly from your research in terms of coping. And even with all that, for me, a lot of times in my clinical practice, it comes down to the particular client, right? And their lived experience, which, you know, is their intrapsychic, interpersonal, social supportive, or the lack thereof sometimes. And a determining factor for me is quite often is the struggle sometimes an end in itself. You know what I mean? They like get stuck in the wormhole, and it becomes you know, a recycling process. Or is the struggle a means to a greater end? As you were talking about Erickson and Fowler and even your research, does it lead to a greater outcome?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Actually, we have found in our study of mortality and spiritual struggle, we found that patients who seem to stay stuck in their struggle over a couple-year period were most likely to decline in their physical health and mental health. So, you know, when we presented that to some hospital chaplains, they say, well, yeah, that makes sense. They got stuck in their struggle, and that's what they look for in their work, people who are getting stuck. But I just want to, your comments also brought to mind the thought that also comes from Daniel Batson's work. Batson talked about an orientation to religion that he called quest. And quest, he said, was an orientation in which the questions become a way of life that people are looking for, enjoy or take meaning out of raising these important existential types of questions. And so these are truth seekers. And yeah, truth seekers may experience some spiritual struggle, but that's part and parcel of being a truth seeker. And so that does become, to some degree, a way of life. And I would distinguish that from people who are saying, who are remaining stuck in a struggle and miserable in their stuckness, if there's such a word.
Professor, we can see that we have a question from the online participant from TC. Can you see that question from the chat box?
Okay, let me see here. Okay.
The question is the theological concept of God, such as God will take care of all things happen to believers individually, has an effect on the positive or negative outcome in coping?
Okay. I'm just reading it here. Well, it's a belief that many people hold. It's one of the important beliefs that I think sustain spiritual involvement, that there is a loving God who's going to care for and in some ways control what happens to people in their lives. So it places all events in this ultimate spiritual context. I think on the one hand, this again is a double-sided coin. On the one hand, it can be a tremendous source of support and reassurance that we're all under the protection of this God who cares for us and in some ways has some control over our lives. On the other hand, when we encounter major crises, events that seem inexplicable, events in which awful things happen to loved ones, people we care about, who have in no way brought on their crisis, then that belief in an all-loving, all-protective God can be difficult to sustain, and it can lead to spiritual struggle. And in that struggle, people may come up with a somewhat different theology, and that theology may be somewhat more complex, but allow them to remain within the kind of, or stay beneath the spiritual and religious umbrella. Others, though, because of these kinds of fundamental conflicts in theology, and we call theodicy, they may not be able to find a way to integrate the bad things happening to good people with their former sense of an all-loving, all-powerful God. And that also may lead to religious and spiritual disengagement. So again, a double-sided coin.
And is there any other questions? Question from Professor Alex Chen. We only allow one more questions.
Okay. Professor Pargamen, thank you for your inspiring talk and insightful talk. I have a question. As we all know, from spiritual struggle or bounce back from spiritual struggle, it's not a linear process, you know. I mean, at the same time, we try to trust in God, but at the same time, we don't think God is helpful. We want to forgive someone, but I can't stand with that person. And then I want to let it go, but I want to try my own ways. Yeah, I think it always happens, kind of up and down, up and down. But a couple of days ago, I think Darren also mentioned that, or maybe also Kirk also mentioned that the influence of spirituality in United States or in many countries kind of have been declining, although the research has been going up, especially to maybe young couples and young people, because I think it's also related to their struggles about the kind of the authority or let it go. Yeah. So a lot of time, maybe some churches or maybe pastors or maybe brother and sister, they want to care that person, but sometimes they use very political terms or different terms to care about them. And then those struggles are very real. And I don't know, but I know you will talk about that because but maybe in the workshop. But I mean, from a spiritual perspective, what should maybe the spiritual leaders, or maybe even the parents, or maybe even the counselors, how to care those person with spiritual struggles, because it's very real, and sometimes it's not easy because they always when once in a spiritual circle, they always say that, oh, I want to pray and want God listen to me, or to hear my prayers. But at the same time, we feel the distance with the God, and kind of nobody from the church can understand me. Yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah, I think we will deal with some of those issues in the workshop, but I also agree with what you began with, which is even in the spiritual realm, change is not linear, and there's a push and a pull, and there's a 2 steps forward and 3 steps back kind of process through it. And it's particularly true with spiritual struggles. These are deep, fundamental kinds of conflicts that aren't resolved easily. It can take months and years for people to work through their struggles. And it's also the case that they apply not only to our clients, but ourselves. They apply to clergy as well, clergy struggle. So these, again, are universal, normal kinds of processes. And I think by shedding some light on them and opening them up for conversation, we have an opportunity to be more responsive to many, many people who are facing struggles in their lives. So I see it's 10:28, and we should probably take a couple-minute break.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we take a 5-minute break. Thank you for presentation and question and comments from other participants. We take a 5-minute break and come back to the workshop. Thank you.